Hello, my name is Ricardo Castro. I'm a PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin and a PhD Career Pathways Fellow and Curatorial Assistant at the Harry Ransom Center. I greet you from the Ransom Center's exhibition gallery, where Gabriel Garcia-Márquez, The Making of a Global Writer, is currently on display. The result of over 2 years' work, led by curator Álvaro Santana-Acuña, the exhibition explores how Garcia-Márquez, who until 1965 was a relatively unknown writer, became a global literary icon. The publication of 100 Years of Solitude in 1967 spearheaded this transformation. In February 2020, when the exhibition had first opened, curator Álvaro Santana-Acuña told the at-capacity auditorium at the Ransom Center there had recently been an exoplanet planet and a star more than 94 million light-years away named Melquiades and Macondo, after the unforgettable gypsy who visits the mythical village of 100 Years of Solitude. This was but one of the many examples that show the extent of Garcia-Márquez's global recognition. The topic of our program today shies away from the celebrity. It centers on the intimacy of the household of Gabriel Garcia-Márquez and Mercedes Barcha in Mexico City, through the eyes of their son. Rodrigo Garcia has written a moving memoir, A Farewell to Gabo and Mercedes, in which he recounts the ailing health and ensuing passing of his father in 2014 and of his mother, Mercedes Barcha, 6 years later. Published in July 2021, the book offers glances of the life of a family as it deals with the memory loss of a loved one, how the familiar body becomes host to a changing mind, the former self all but gone except for occasional flashes. The book offers vignettes of the larger-than-life literary genius in his all-too-human frailty. He gradually becomes unable to recognize faces and loses threads of ongoing conversations. In his last years, the Nobel laureate reread his books. Where on earth did all this come from? He asked Rodrigo. Sometimes, we learn, he would be surprised to see his portrait on the back cover of a book he'd written and just read, so he would reopen it to read it again. At the memorial for Garcia-Márquez in Mexico City, thousands of people waited for hours to pay their respects to the deceased writer. They placed flowers, books, pendants, notes. A firm reminder, writes Rodrigo, that he also very much belonged to the people. Garcia-Márquez used to say that everyone has 3 lives: the public, the private, and the secret. The exhibition behind me offers an intriguing look at the evolution of Garcia-Márquez's public life and persona. Rodrigo Garcia's book shows us evocative glimpses of his private ones. Rodrigo Garcia is a writer and director. He was born in Colombia and grew up in Mexico City. His feature films as writer and director include 9 Lives, Albert Nobbs, and 4 Good Days. Garcia has directed television series such as 6 Feet Under, The Sopranos, and the pilot of Big Love, for which he received an Emmy nomination. He also directed several episodes for HBO's In Treatment, where in addition to director, he was also a writer, executive producer, and the series showrunner. Garcia currently lives in Los Angeles with his family. Engaging Mr. Garcia in conversation is Álvaro Santana-Acuña. Dr. Santana-Acuña earned a PhD in sociology from Harvard University. He is associate professor of sociology at Whitman College, where he teaches courses in cultural sociology. He is the author of Ascent to Glory, How 100 Years of Solitude was written and became a global classic, an award-winning study of the imagination, production, and circulation of 100 Years of Solitude, one of the best-selling novels of all time. He is also the curator of Gabriel Garcia-Márquez, The Making of a Global Writer, the first major exhibition featuring documents from the Garcia-Márquez archives. We invite you to visit the exhibition, Gabriel Garcia-Márquez, The Making of a Global Writer, which will be on display at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin until January 2nd, 2022. For those of you who can't make it to Austin, we invite you to explore the exhibition virtually on the Ransom Center's website, where you can also explore materials from Gabriel Garcia-Márquez's papers available online through our digital collections. I welcome you to A Farewell to Gabo and Mercedes, a conversation with Rodrigo Garcia.
Well, it's a pleasure talking to you, Rodrigo, about your wonderful and moving memoir. So, A Farewell to Gabo and Mercedes. So he's actually the edition. And also those of you who read Spanish, also you can also read it in Spanish with actually some extra photographs in the appendix. So Rodrigo, I actually want to start our conversation by putting on the table that as a filmmaker, one of your creative materials is the image. And I would like to start our conversation by precisely asking you if you could summarize with an image the story that you tell in your memoir, which one would be that image?
Well, it would be hard to pick one because just my instinct as a screenwriter was, of course, it's the visual that was obviously the feelings, the past, the what you're living through. But many, obviously, my father in bed in his last day, and other moments I describe in the memoir, like walking into the Palacio de Bellas Artes where the memorial was being held, and walking upstairs and down hallways and then opening to a door that pretty much fed us into a stage. And all of a sudden we were on a stage with literally dozens, perhaps over 100 photographers and videographers and journalists in front of us. And I think that sort of summed up that duality of having to navigate the private and the public during those days. I mean, there are different themes, obviously, but that was one of them. And the book itself is a manifestation of that duality, the balancing the private and the public.
Yeah, certainly see that throughout. So I also want to take our listeners to the beginning of the project, right? So you say that you started collecting notes as the final days of your father's life unfolded, and you also say that you were not completely sure about what you would be doing with these notes. So I just wanted to ask you, when did you make the decision to turn it into a book?
Not for a long time. I mean, as I describe in the book, even as I was taking notes, I was very conflicted about recording such private moments. And then when right the days after my father died, I thought, I better get this down in some form as quickly as I can, because I may not want to go back to it. And while it was fresh in my mind, but I really had no plan. I thought, well, maybe it'll just be something for my daughters to read, or my brother, his children. So I wrote what is about 3/4 of what's in the book. And I put it aside. For many reasons, I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know what it was. It seemed too long to be an article, too short to be a book. And most of all, I knew that my mother would not like if that private account was published. So I just put it aside, and not because there's anything particularly revealing or salacious in the memoir, but it is, after all, I mean, I'm going to take that back. Of course it's private in the sense that it happened within the walls of our house, but I always felt, as the writer of it, that you have your right as a writer to talk about your own feelings, even if you're not revealing anything particularly scandalous or secret. But in essence, to answer your question, I put it aside. And it wasn't until 5 years later, 6 almost, that my mother died in August of 2020, when I saw what really my theme was. My theme, what I wanted to write about, was the farewell to both parents. And in a way, the end of that world that you grew up in, which never really ends, but at least the people are no longer there physically. So that's when I realized that's what the piece could be, and I went back and worked in the stuff about my mother.
So, and I also wanted to ask you, because during the pandemic you also published a very celebrated and widely circulated op-ed for the New York Times, both in Spanish and in English. And I just wanted to know where that piece fits within the larger project of writing the memoir.
Well, it doesn't really, because when I wrote it, my mother was still alive. And that piece was born out of those first few weeks of the pandemic, when it was so common to see headlines, love in the time of the pandemic, love in the time of coronavirus, and just quotes and headlines that just harked back to love in the time of cholera. And like I mentioned in the piece, my father had a lifelong fascination with
plagues.
I think because plagues are so, they're invisible, they're indiscriminate. You don't know who's going to draw the unlucky number. And I think also because they are a great obstacle to, loved ones. And I think probably to lovers, they're a great obstacle. So in that sense, he was always obsessed with them. So, after in those first few weeks, talking often with my brother and with my mother and discussing that, I thought, wow, what would my father make of this? He would be fascinated, happily and unhappily fascinated. And so I wrote him this letter, which, perhaps he read.
Yeah,
but it was that reflection on, what was going on in the world. I think his insatiable curiosity about all things human would have been, totally engrossed.
Yeah, and I think we're still within that process, right? So which it hasn't fully ended. So I think there were still many
It
things
hasn't.
to
It hasn't fully ended. Although, I often think it's one who must really make an effort to remember the mindset in those first few weeks. We have lost that amazement, to know that you woke up in the morning and everybody you knew across the world, every human being was locked away in their house.
That's right.
In the cave, hiding from the predator.
And I think for me, this is one of the things I remember the most, to the point that I still wake up today and I really think, was this really real? Because even as I still remember it, and it's so fresh, but still it feels like surreal. So I also want to take an opportunity with this conversation to also show some of the images that are actually part of the Harry Ransom Center, where the archives of Garcia-Márquez are. And I'm going to share this image, which I hope you can see. And first of all, I actually want to ask you, but you talk about the club of four in the book to really capture, the very strong relationship between the four of you. And I think this image summarizes that really well. And I wonder if you actually have recollections about this precise moment. I know that was in Barcelona, right?
This was in Barcelona. It must have been around 1970. So I was 10, my brother was 7 or 8. I remember, I don't remember all the details. I remember, unfortunately, I've entered that, that decade where remembering names is horrible. And I apologize to the photographer. I can't remember her name, but I remember the session. And, this was, I think, probably the most memorable picture to come out of it. And this sat it's still I think, in my father's studio, or it sat in the studio, for decades, a copy of this picture. The club of four.
Yeah, and I wanted to also show that picture because, you were raised in a family and countries, Mexico, Spain, Colombia, where Spanish is the primary language. And, professionally and artistically, actually, you have chosen English as your language of expression. And I just wanted to ask you, how did it feel to you to write about your family and about this very important event in English?
I wrote in English because I really didn't start writing till I was in my late 30s, and I started to write screenplays. And really, with the exception of, a couple of, that editorial, I wrote another one earlier, the book, everything I've written, 98% of what I've written are screenplays. And they are in English. I mean, I have written a few things in Spanish, but mostly in English. So I'm just a faster writer in English, and I don't have to, be worried about my style and how my Spanish compares to other written Spanish. So, it's just easier for me. I mean, that was not without guilt. It wasn't lost on me that I was writing the book in English. And my intention was to write the Spanish version myself. And I started to do it, but I just did not have the strength to undertake the emotional journey again. Because I know that when you're translating your own book, it's beyond translating. You're looking for ways to speak.
I'm doing that right now.
Yes, you're looking for your voice. It's not just finding the right word, but a whole new voice. And I just was not able, I already felt so overwhelmed with the fact that I'd written the book and that it was going to be published. In the end, a translator in Barcelona, worked on it, and she did a very good job. But of course, when I received it, because it's still my mother tongue, I still had to dive into it, not to make corrections to her work, because her work was very good, but to try to find my own voice in it. So I couldn't totally escape. But I was thinking, I received the news the other day that the book was coming out, I think in Bulgarian or Turkish, and I thought, I'm so relieved I don't have to. I don't speak all those languages so that I have to. So yes, it's easier for me. And there is some guilt, of course, that it's not written in Spanish, but you know what? I'm a perfectly bilingual, bicultural person. I still feel very much like a Latin American, and yes, I felt some guilt, but it's not sinking me.
So but you also made I just wanted to ask you if you also made the choice of leaving some key sentences and words in Spanish in the English version. I wonder, if you can walk us through the process of actually deciding to do that, because I think it certainly brings some of the emotion behind the words as they were spoken, I guess, in the original language.
Yeah, because mostly those sentences are things my mother and father said, and obviously they spoke Spanish, primarily, my mother exclusively, and I didn't want to translate them, although I sometimes wrote them in Spanish and then immediately my version of them in English. But I wanted to hear them like I heard them. I think like a lot of the things parents say to you, they're more than sentences. They are sentences, as in something a judge might impose on you. They just have this ring to them.
Una sentencia.
Yes, like a 5-year sentence. So yes, I wanted, like when I say in the book, sometimes I said to my mom that she might benefit from some therapy or some anxiety medication. And she said, no soy una histérica. No, I am not a hysteric, which is such a 19th century thing to say. The idea that a woman in some, psychic turmoil is a hysteric. It really tells you a lot about her feelings towards therapy.
And as you said, that's a very 19th century theme in novels and plays. I'm thinking about Ibsen and House of Dolls, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so and actually now that we're also talking about your mother, so one of the things I discovered while I was doing research in the Ransom Center is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, she was actually compiling over the years newspaper clippings that friends and relatives and fans, as well as the agency, sent to Mercedes, and then she compiled 21 of these scrapbooks. But also, while I was actually doing research, I discovered that she also had another one about you, and I wonder if you knew that she was keeping. And she was actually, if you knew that she was actually keeping another scrapbook about you and your career, when did you find out about the existence of this scrapbook?
I think I might have seen it at some point when I was looking through albums, but even looking at it now, it doesn't ring that much of a bell. Like, I'm not surprised, because I do remember that she would keep this, the news clippings, especially that people would send her. But yeah, it's a little, it's fresh to me right now. I didn't, it's the kind of thing almost don't want, you want to look away from. Do you know what I mean? I think
Yeah.
it's mother appropriate.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Yes.
I think that, you know,
Yeah.
proud mother.
Proud
Yeah,
parents. Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Okay. So
Yeah.
I also now want to explore a little bit more the angle of aging in your book. You know, so while I was actually reading your memoir, I stumbled upon an article in the Harvard Magazine, and I'm going to quote. So so it cites a study that says today an estimated 47 million people worldwide live with dementia. And that's roughly 15% of the US population. And that is the exact number of the population of Spain. And behind each of these 47 million numbers are 47 million people and 47 million stories, right? And of course, you know, your father belonged to this growing group of people back in the day. So, and I think it's really, you know, one of these also coincidences that when I was also doing research for at the Ransom Center,
Oh yeah.
they released the first part of his autobiography, and they decided, I think it was Espectador, La Memoria de Gabriel.
Yeah, I hadn't
And
seen this. I don't remember this picture.
yeah.
It's funny because in this picture, I can tell by my father's attitude that he's already in his 70s,
Mm-hmm.
but he's still all there mostly. You know, just the way he's reading that, you know, this is probably the early 2000s.
Yeah, I think so too.
And
Yeah.
you know, this is before he started showing signs, but he feels like he's all there.
Mm-hmm. So and certainly as famous as your father was, I think for me one of the most revealing parts of your memoir is really to take us beyond the image of the literary genius and show us the facts of a human being and his family coping with dementia for years, right? So and you know, what would you say were, you know, when did you notice that there were the first sign of these his loss of memory were present, right? So you mentioned the dates, but
Yeah, it's, you know, it's hard to say because it's a very gradual process. And of course, it has some overlap with very, you know, natural, like right now, you know, I was not able to remember the name of that photographer
mm-hmm.
or the name of my translator. I mean, both shameful, but I just have to accept it. I'm 62 and this is what happens, especially when you're, you know, in the spotlight. So I cannot say, you know, you start noticing, when you start noticing, it's a little more far along. The person seems more distracted, rather than not remembering a name. They don't remember, you know, they get lost in the middle of a sentence or they get
Mm-hmm.
lost in the middle of a thought. And it's more than just, oh, I forgot what I was going to say. You know, it really is like something happens in the middle of a sentence. And then even when that happens, it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. You know, the person might have very lucid days. So I can't really remember. I do remember us being in Barcelona for a Christmas holiday, you know, maybe 2006, perhaps. And my wife telling me that my dad said to him, I know who you are, but I can't remember your name.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning he knows that she's my wife and that, you know, we're all there together, but she couldn't remember her name. And there's a friend whose name I can't remember, who told me recently, and she told me this after she read my book, and I wish I'd known it before because I would have included it. You know, she ran into my dad probably in the same period, and he said to her, I know you and I know I love you, but I don't know your name.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, you know, even these things that you mentioned that are not part of the book also bring me the memories of my own maternal grandmother, because she suffered from dementia, and as you said, it's a very gradual process. And something for me that I found in the book that completely resonated with my own experience is how nonetheless they have this capacity to really bring things from the past. So I remember, for instance, in the case of my grandma, I remember her smile on her face when we played some songs from the 1930s and 40s that were part of her childhood and adolescence. And I know that was also the case with your father. And I just wonder if you can tell us maybe what were some of the songs that he would like to have played
Well,
all the
you know,
time?
obviously all the vallenatos, you know, which are taken back all the way to his childhood. And, you know, the poetry, which he knew by heart since he was an adolescent, especially of the Spanish Golden Age. So those those things were, you know, were definitely the last to go. And it's funny because with the friends, you know, sometimes a friend would say to me, "Oh, I'm going to see your dad tomorrow. Do you think he'll recognize me?" And I would say, maybe not, because you're only a friend from 10 or 20 years ago. Sometimes it's the friends from 40 and 50 years ago that were recognized. But if you were if you were a friend from the last 20 years, sadly, it was too recent, you know. But again, there were good days. I mean, there was something, I didn't write about this in the book because I'd forgotten it, actually. I'm just remembering it now. My parents had an apartment in Paris, and when my dad was already quite advanced, you know, my mother, my brother, and I decided to sell it because it was not being used anymore. And we didn't consult with him because he was not really there. But then one day, I guess he was having a good day, and he said to us, "What happened with the apartment?" And we were taken by surprise, and we said, "Oh, we sold it." And he's like, "What do you mean? Nobody told me." And so for a moment, we were all discombobulated. But alas, 10 minutes later, he'd forgotten the subject. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and also, of course, you know, not only Gabo, but also Mercedes is aging, and they're aging together. And I wonder, you know, again, thinking not just about, you know, the public persona, but thinking about them as just, you know, like ordinary people. So how did they take care of themselves, and especially, you know, whether you actually think that in your memoir, you know, there are also ways in which we can actually think about, learn about how to age also on a personal level.
Well, I think there's, you know, there are two examples, or two very different examples of aging, because, you know, obviously my father had the long fade out. You know, physically he was in pretty good condition until the very, very end. You know, without having exercised a day in his life. He lived to 87, and you know, my mother, a lifelong smoker, also lived to 87. Her head was always in pretty good shape. I mean, she really had a tremendous memory. But you know, her body did deteriorate because of age, but mostly because of smoking. I don't know what the secret is, but she, you know, her spirits were always high. You know, she was always preoccupied with age. I mean, I'm sure she knew, you know, she was conscious of how old she was. And, you know, she would occasionally say what people that age say, you know, if I'm still around, if I'm here next year, you know, the normal stuff. But she was always able to enjoy things. And I think that's what keeps you young. But I don't know if, I suppose a part of it could be a choice, but you know, you can choose to make it a choice, but you have to be blessed with that ability to enjoy things till the end. And she did enjoy them till the end. And you know, every day I see things that I wish she had seen, because she would enjoy them. You know, I'm sure we would have spoken about the whole vaccine thing forever, and variants, and people have asked me, what would she have said about the book? I think she would have said, you know, you're a big gossip and you're a loudmouth, and I don't know why you wrote this book. And then she'd call her friends and she'd say, did you read his book? It's beautiful. Do you know what I mean? She would chew me out and then devour good reviews.
Yeah,
you know?
I must say that I was really intrigued and taken by your descriptions of your mother, so being so much into gossip, you know, and while at the same time there's this really interesting tension that she wants to protect so much of her family life. And I think that's a really, you know, very interesting tension to explore as a character, right?
Yeah, because listen, you know, they both had an enormous appetite for the life of others, and what, you know, the travails of others. And sometimes it's gossip, sometimes it's just curiosity, sometimes it's fodder for a novel, sometimes it's stories you can tell in a, you know, at a dinner party. But yeah, that never waned with her, you know, the life of others. That's the most fascinating thing.
Yeah. Okay. So I also have a series of questions about the final process, death itself. But I also want to talk about how it actually connects to your own work, because in your films and series, you have actually dealt with death, sometimes in explicitly as in episodes of Six Feet Under, which tells the lives of the Fisher family who runs a funeral home in LA, where, as I said, death is a daily experience. Yet in your book, it feels as if the passing of your father was a discovery of death, or maybe certainly your most intimate encounter with death. And I wonder how this passing changed your view of about death on a personal and creative level, where you see that there is a change there.
Well, it's hard to say because, it changes every day, obviously. In some ways, witnessing the end of my parents, it was shocking to see how simple it was. Not emotionally simple for us, dealing with it, but both of them just went to sleep. My dad after years of a long fade out, and my mom after a 48-hour, dive. But that juxtaposition of the enormity of the event and the simplicity of it. I want to give you an example, but keeping all things in perspective, because I don't want it to be grotesque. If you've ever witnessed a dog being put to sleep, it's incredibly simple. And yet it's, a person dying, even a pet dying can be,
extremely
overwhelming for a family.
Absolutely.
But the veil is very thin and it's very easily crossed. And that contradiction between the enormity of the event and the simplicity of it, really stayed with me.
And do you think that your father was aware of that notion of the veil, the thinness of the passage? Because he talked to you, or at least it seems that on a tangential level. So you talked about death. So you mentioned in the book when you asked him about, well, how does it feel to be 80 years old? And then he replied that it was really sad. And I wonder if it was more explicit about maybe how he wanted to die, or how he envisioned or he imagined his own death.
I think, again, like when we were talking about my mother and attitudes towards therapy, I think they were old school. They had an old school attitude of it's bad luck to talk about those things. It took them a long time to sit down and write a will, for example. We encouraged them to structure their estate and to do some future planning, which more and more people do, especially when there was so much to take care of. They came around to that. But I think death, I think, was a lifelong preoccupation with him. I think he was always, he always said, I've heard him say a couple times that he knew he would be scared when the time came, but who knows? I don't know what his, what he would have been like at 87 with his full, mental acumen. But I think, that obsession with death is one of the things that fuels writers. I think it's not uncommon, that desire to frame experience, to order it, to tell a life. I don't think fear of death makes you a writer, but I think all great writers, many great writers, are obsessed with death.
Yeah, and I think you certainly, I think even in your memoir, having different fragments in which we see death in some of his books, and certainly some of my colleagues have also pointed out, and readers, it's very common that Garcia-Márquez opened his books with a death-related event, right? And I couldn't help but to think, to what extent we can actually think of your own memoir as actually bringing his creative and personal obsession with death to a full circle. This is actually you who is writing about a death that he couldn't write about, which is actually his own death, right?
Yeah, and I could only write it, of course, from my point of view, but yeah, he said that to me a couple of times, that he really resented that about death, that it was the only thing in his life he was not going to be able to write about. Mm-hmm. Everything else he wrote in some form, he addressed, or any event or feeling or idea he addressed in one form or another. But that one, of course, was impossible. So yeah, in some ways that is, I suppose, one of the, an impetus to the book, although I hadn't thought about it in such a literal way, but it is to, to tell that final chapter. Also, it's a chapter that only my brother and I could have written. There's no, no one else was a witness to that. Even the people who were there those days were not everywhere at all times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also want to say that your book is also a celebration of life. And I think one of the aspect that I like the most about the book is precisely your ability to connect us with Gabo at the most intimate, personal level, right? So while also showing us that while he was a humorous person, he was also an introvert, right? And I think that's also wonderful to see as part of his personality, right? And certainly also the humorous part of it, which is the whole stuff about the nightmares and you and Gonzalo having to wake him up, and I think that's also beautiful.
Wake him up from the hallway, from far away, so that he wouldn't startle us by waking up startled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then asking you also to kiss him after his nightmare. Yeah. Also, your memoir opens a wonderful window for us into his creative process, and I wanted to show a picture here, again from the archive. I actually forgot to show this image of them celebrating their 53rd anniversary as part of that.
I've never seen this. I suppose it was in one of the albums, but I'd never seen it. It's very lovely.
Yeah, it's 53rd anniversary. It says I think 2007 or 6, and it's precisely about how to age well together. So, and I also wanted to show this photograph which you took, and I think this is one of the best pictures of him at work. I'm not sure if you can share with us some of your recollections about taking this photograph. I know it was taken in Barcelona.
It was actually taken in Mallorca. And this was 1974 or 75. He's correcting the galleys of the Autumn of the Patriarch, which was a long, the book took a long time. He had the great success with 100 Years of Solitude in 1967, and then he published a few short stories. But the book was a big struggle. I think it was hard to follow the success of 100 Years of Solitude. So this was in a hotel where we were staying in Mallorca. I'm not sure if it was a hotel or an apartment. It must have been a hotel. And, I would already, I think around age 12, 13, 14, I started getting very interested in photography. And I used to share he had a Nikon camera that I used to work with. And so I took this. I remember, what I liked about it when I took it was, the little paper wedges that he used on two of the legs to balance it out, and those sort of white moccasins that he might wear without socks. That's very much him.
Yeah, and I might say that now that you said it was taken in Mallorca, it makes sense to me, because I was always a little bit confused about that picture being taken in Barcelona, and yet he was actually bare feet. And I know that in Barcelona it can get really hot, but still,
and also he had his proper study at home. This was a hotel room. I mean, the picture was actually bigger, and there was an empty bookcase, and of course I lost the negative because I was 14, but it's been reproduced enough that it's out there.
Yeah, and he didn't know that you were photographing him, right?
No, he didn't see this till later,
Yeah.
but when I showed it to him, he was very high on it. So this book, this was in the back cover of
Yeah.
the first edition of the
Yeah.
Autumn of the Patriarch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think also, you know, I'm also like to show this picture because I think it speaks very clearly to one of the things that you mentioned in your memoir, which was his capacity, his capacity for, you even call like his power of concentration, right?
Incredible, yeah.
Yeah, and I wonder if you know, you can tell us a little bit more about that, especially as, because you know, this is a manuscript of One Day of Solitude, right? And then, you know, readers are usually exposed to the finalized product, right? But rarely do they get to see things like this, right? So this is, you know, one of the pages from Of Love and Other Demons, right? And you know, for me, you know, there are many of manuscripts that we can certainly study, but for me, this paragraph is particularly impressive because he revised the entire paragraph, and the last sentence is a beautiful sentence to close the paragraph. And I think that as someone who is in this creative process, is that okay? I arrived, I got it, this is it. And then that sentence appears in the next manuscript, and yet he started editing again that paragraph, and then we see numerous of several other versions. And then, whereas most creators and writers who have said, okay, this is it, I got it, he would actually continue to go on, and then that final sentence in that paragraph, it didn't make it into the final book, right? And I think, you know, you remember you certainly talk about his creative process. And also, you know, I wanted to ask you, when did he know that he had to stop?
I think, you know, both things are true. He obviously, you know, was a perfectionist, like this kind of artist is. But there's several steps that seem contradictory, but you know, there's this not giving up until something is perfect. And I'm not surprised that it's the second paragraph, because sometimes, you know, so much is put into a beginning, that's chapter 1, that then, you know, chapter 2 or the second paragraph you might take it a little easier on it, but then when you look back, you say, oh no, it's not up to, you know, it's not up to par. So I'm not surprised he got, you know, he worked this second paragraph. But the day did come with all books where he really thought it was as good as he could make it. But although that may sound very confident, he then never reread the book because he was afraid that he would find it deficient and that it would paralyze him for the next book. So it's a you know, that whole cycle of, I'm not sure if this is any good, to I think this is perfect and it's finished and I wouldn't change a comma, to okay, yes, but I'm never going to read this again in case it's crap. So you know, it's cyclical.
Yeah, and you also mentioned some of the hurdles or obstacles that he and I remember also reading an interview or something that you mentioned a long while ago about, but no, Garcia-Márquez not being especially good with dialogue, right? And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about some of these hurdles that would just show up again and again in these daily family lunch conversations, in which he was just was super happy about, you know, what he has written in the morning, and then in the evening he would start to have doubts, and then at night he would be like almost terrified, and then the following morning the cycle started again.
Yeah. Regarding the dialogue, you know, I don't think, it's not that he was not good at it, but I think he always thought, and he did say to me once, he only uses dialogue when he absolutely had to. And I think, you know, if I had to guess, I would say that comes from that narrator's instinct that the narrator is God. And so the narrator tells the tale, and only when putting something in the words of in the mouth of a character, those, you know, how many lines of dialogue are there in 100 Years of Solitude? No more than 12, I would guess. You know, 1 or 2 per chapter, nothing.
Yes, very, very little, yeah.
So I think that comes from that, you know. and I know he was impatient with theater. You know, he used to say too many words, not because he disliked it, but he just, I think that was, for him, it was a different
genre.
you know, as different from a novel as
Yeah.
making a movie or a sculpture or, you know, a painting. And then, yeah, he had that cycle that I describe in the book where, you know, he in the afternoon, you know, he'd come to lunch after working in the morning, convinced he was writing a masterpiece. And then that confidence would wane. And by the next morning, he was worried that the book was a bust. And then he'd, you know, and sometimes the books were a bust and he'd abandon them or pick them up later. And then after lunch, he'd come back and say, "Oh, this book is a masterpiece." But you know, it's a cycle that I think really any creative person knows. You know, it's that voice when you're writing that. You know, someone asked me, I was recently working on a movie, and someone asked me, "How's it going?" And I said, you know, I'm a genius several times a day, and I'm an idiot several times a day. That's how it feels. And that's, I'm sure, I mean, you know that. That's how it feels to write anything. You know, you go from thinking, oh, this is terrific, to what am I doing?
Yeah, and I'm not sure if that's your case, but as he didn't want to reread his books, I wonder also if you actually rewatch your films and episodes.
No, I can't really. I mean, the episodes are easier because I didn't write the episodes. You know, 6 Feet Under and series like that were written by, you know, the team of writers that worked with Alan Ball, who created the series, and those were terrific. So those are easy to watch because I'm not, you know, hitting myself over the head judging them. I thought they were always really quite well written. Yeah, you know, sometimes years later you can revisit things and be a little more forgiving, but it's very hard. It's very hard. You just have to do the work and, you know, keep your nose to the grindstone and keep going.
So, and do you think maybe that's also the reason why, you know, if it were not maybe for your mother, you know, we have never have been able to see documents like this? Because one of the things that you mentioned in the memoir is that one of the assignments that your father had for you and Gonzalo after the novel or the work he was working on was finished was actually to destroy the manuscripts, right? And I wonder if you knew what you were doing at the time, or if you really care about that create destruction.
Well, let me tell you something. I was curious to see this page that you just showed, because I don't, you know, there is no manuscript of his books, sort of, you know, it's only his books in his last 10, 15 years where this survives because my mother kept them. But there is no page with this level of correction that exists of 100 years of you know, the Autumn of the Patriarch, because he would, you know, once the chapter was finished, he would destroy it, and then he would make, you know, corrections in the galleys. And I don't even know if younger people are going to know what the galleys are, because now you make corrections on a Word or a Google Doc. But you know, they would send you printout of the page, and you would make hand corrections, and then they would, you know, reprint. Yeah, I mean, it was fun to see this this paragraph that's so you know, corrected in such detail, because that doesn't exist of his earlier books.
Certainly, yeah. And I also wanted to ask you maybe a more personal question, which is, you know, having seen him
more personal, even more personal.
Well, this is about creativity part. So it's actually how you think that seeing him in action, right? So knowing about the intimacies of his creative process, how do you think it has informed your own approach to creativity?
Well, it's funny because, you know, like I said, I didn't start writing scripts till I was in my mid to late 30s, but I realized that you know, you did pick up things along the way. You know, you had a sense of what writing and revising was, and how you can feel enthusiastic about something and then doubt it, but you have to keep going. You know, that sort of, you know, that sort of relentlessness where you just keep going because it can get better, and you work and you work and you work. You know, that's, I guess I picked that up along the way. You know, I say to a lot of screenwriters who are starting, you know, the objective of your first draft is just to reach the last page, meaning you must persevere, because there's always a long number of excuses in the middle to abandon, and often to abandon to start something better. You know, that's what you do.
Yeah.
But
or that you think that is better.
Oh, you think it's better, but you know, once you get to the middle of it, it'll be the same. So you know, these were not conscious things, but I did pick up something of that, you know, artistic work ethic, which I guess just, you know, propels you through your insecurity. And I mean, you know, there's something incredibly arrogant about being an artist. You know, here I wrote 400 pages, read them because they're wonderful. Or in the case of a movie director, oh, give me $20 million, I'll make you a pretty movie. You know, you really have to you really have to have a lot of chutzpah to you know, to do that. But that's part and parcel of being a creative person, I think.
Yeah. And I'm also asking you that question because, you know, filmmaking, you know, while some of the skills and the ethic, you know, there would be certainly some similarities, you know, like making a movie is not an individual effort. It's actually a collective form of art, right? Yeah. And I think that takes, you know, that takes an entirely different set of skills, and then that just writing, and now that you have written the memoir, you know, that writing, you know, a book, right, which you, as you said, the narrator is God, but in a film, you know, you are one of the many gods, right?
You're you're one of the many slaves, you know, the slaves to the project. You know, I recently finished shooting a movie, and it was a reminder of, you know, how frustrating it is to, you know, have to, you know, get 180, 70, 50 people together every morning and try to mold this thing. And yet at the same time, that I find that part of it very thrilling. You know, I find the collaboration thrilling, the sort of circus quality about it. You know, here we are in this place and we're going to tell a story, and there's a whole bunch of people, each with a particular skill. You know, that's what makes a set so interesting and frustrating. The fact that you're working with, you know, 25 experts. You know, everyone's an expert in their department, the prop master, the designer, the sound person, the, you know, the special effects, and you have to both listen and not listen. And, you know, sometimes a director's greatest strength, which is their vision, their tunnel vision, is also the weakness. You know, you have this way you see things, and that's what might make the work memorable. But you know, when do you deviate from it? But that's just the nature of the movies. You know, it's very frustrating to share that with another 30 people, and yet I also have a great time doing it. I mean, I think, and yes, like you said, it requires many very different kinds of skills, but one of the principal skills that requires is ignoring that voice that tells you this is crap, and you just go on. And I think writers have to do that. You know, there's always something in the room telling you, who cares? And you just have to ignore that voice and keep going.
Yeah, well, we're gonna so we're also gonna keep going, so we have 10 minutes left. So, and I also want to take the opportunity also to also talk about certainly about Mercedes. So I also want to share one of the images of Mercedes when she was young. So you have probably seen this many times.
That one I remember, yes.
And Gabo said, and you mentioned that in the memoir, that he thinks she's the most surprising, asombrosa person. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about what you think he found the most surprising about Mercedes.
You know, it's hard to say because he never went into it in any detail, but I have to imagine, you know, her ability to adapt herself from a girl from a small town in Colombia. I mean, well educated, you know, she went to Catholic school and was always an exceptional student, etc., but no university. you know, to become someone that was, you know, quite capable and formidable in the middle of my dad's world, which was huge, you know, huge. I mean, there was a point in the 80s where all you had to do for the phone to ring in my father's house was to put it down. You know, you finish a phone call, you put it down, the phone would ring. I mean, it was exhausting. And you know, the callers were everything from, you know, obsessed fans, including, you know, deranged people, all the way to some of the big artists of the world and heads of state and, you know, insurgent leaders from you know, insurgent movements. I mean, it was a big world, and she was at the center of it quite, I wouldn't say easily, but she managed it. You know, the world became big, and she grew into it. And I think that must have been one of the things that he found
most surprising,
marvelous. I think marvelous about the two of them, because, you know, there was something about my parents, and I wish I would have said this in the book, but I didn't think of it till later. You know, they were a combination of something very sophisticated and very parochial. You know, in some ways they were people from small towns in Colombia, and at the same time they were very sophisticated people about life. So I'm sure he could see that in her, and that, you know, and he admired it.
Yeah,
look at this picture. My mom was convinced her whole life that she was very unphotogenic.
Well, I don't think so.
I know, it's ridiculous.
Yeah. So let me also share with you what is the surprising part about Mercedes is that while I was actually doing research in the archives at the Ransom Center, I actually came across this. You may have seen this before. So this is actually, so as you said, you know, she was very well educated. She attended an important school. And then, you know, what's really surprising about this is that Mercedes wrote this text, this essay, an award-winning essay for high school, a geography about the Magdalena River, which is the most important river in Colombia, and actually at the center of several of Garcia-Márquez's works. And yet, for someone who was going to be married to a writer, the first one in the family who got a literary award was actually not him, but her.
And writing about the Rio Magdalena, which is, you know, a seminal part of his work.
Yeah,
you know?
And absolutely. And I think, you know, what's also funny here, you know, is the coincidence, but I know that maybe they appreciated that even more, is that she wrote, or this text was actually published the very same year that Garcia-Márquez published his first his first ever published piece of prose, La Tercera Resignación, the third resignation. And I couldn't help but to think when I discovered this, is that to what extent Mercedes knew early on, or was able to see through, you know, the life that she was going to see in terms of understanding the difficulties of the creative process and being with someone who was a creator, because she, in her, you know, her teens, she actually wrote, you know,
I mean, if this was the same year, that means she must have been around 15 and he must have been around 20. Or, you know, 16 and he was 20. I actually had never seen this until I saw it, you know, a couple years ago at the Ransom Center at the, you know, the show, the Making of a Global Writer. So that was not part of the family archive. I think that's something that the Ransom Center found afterwards, you know, along the way. So that was fun to discover.
Yeah, well, I was actually responsible for the selection.
Oh, good.
of that piece.
Well, yes, I know, of course. I don't have to explain. I don't have to explain the show to you since you created it, but you curated it. But
it was wonderful to really have that piece really early on, to really maybe add another layer to what otherwise was a very long relationship. And I think, you know, I think that you need to be with someone who understands the depth of your, you know, creativity, right? So, and I think, you know, I think there is a little hint of that there So there is also
there were a lot of things in that show that I'd never seen. There were pictures that I'd never seen, and it was you know, a lot of it was familiar, of course, but there were some discoveries for me for sure.
Okay.
That was right. I went there 3 weeks before the world closed down.
Yeah, well, now it's actually reopened, and you know, people actually have the chance to see it, and it's, you know, it's traveling to Mexico next year.
To Mexico City, yeah.
So hopefully no pandemic, so people will be able to enjoy it normally.
Yeah.
So there is also for me another important word that, you know, it's so hard to translate actually into English, which is a word that was in your mother's mouth, I believe, often, which is compostura. And I wonder if you can walk us through, you know, the meaning of that word and how it played out in how she taught you, and also how she used that to go through what she called the zoo of the public death of Garcia-Márquez.
Yeah, I mean, composure is not a bad translation. You know, it's really how you hold yourself, you know, in the middle of whatever is going on. And you know, she was a master of that, even despite, you know, what I thought was, you know, her insecurities, her anxieties, you know, what everyone has. You know, I describe in the book that moment where the garage door opener broke down, and so she had to get out of the car and walk literally, you know, she must have walked nothing, 15 feet, 18 feet from the car, and all the dozens of people who were out there, just the street became absolutely silent. And she didn't even raise her head. It was like she was just walking to the bathroom. But I know she knows where she was. You know, she knows where she was. She knows she was being looked at, but there was no pretense, no fake humility, no arrogance. This is, you know, I'm walking to my house, and I don't care who's here.
Okay, yeah. So I also have a final question about a little more about the future, and I think that's also something that you mentioned in the book. So you actually talk about how is it days after your father's passing. So you were on the plane, and someone next to you was actually reading 100 of Solitude on her phone. Well, my first question is actually, how did you find out about that without that person not feeling that you were actually kind of, you know, looking over her shoulder?
No, I mean, she was literally the person sitting next to me. And, you know, I put my seat back, and, you know, she had her phone right there. She was on her phone, which is curious on a plane. So my eyes went to the screen, because our eyes go to the screen all the time.
Yeah.
And it was a page from 100 Years of Solitude. You know, I only needed to read a few words to recognize it. Yeah, I mean, she, of course, had been, you know, seen the news for the last 4 days, and it, you know, and I always assume she was probably rereading it, you know, because it's hard to read that kind of novel for the first time on your phone. But yeah, it was, I mean, it was an incredible moment. I mean, the moment I saw it, I said, okay, well, whatever I write could end right here. You know?
So, and where do you think, because as you said, that's contingent moment, right? So we know that when a famous artist passes away, his or her work, you know, comes back to life again. But this is certainly not the case with your father's work, right? And with other artists, right? So what do you think is the secret of Gabo's connection with his readers globally, and, you know, across time and space?
You know, it's hard to say, you know, and he would be the first to say, you know, who knows what the books will feel like 200, 300, 400 years from now. But, you know, he lived long enough to see them go at least 2 or 3 generations after him. You know, I still run into people in their 20s who said, oh, 100 Years of Solitude blew me away. So, yeah, I mean, what that connection is, I think, you know, I read somewhere, I can't remember where, but something that's very true. You know, he was rare, especially in the case of 100 Years of Solitude, in the sense that the book had a big conceit. It was a big postmodern experiment, but really his commitment to story and juicy characters. And I think the book is very unfairly, you know, or inaccurately framed as a magical realist book. I mean, yes, there are honestly no more than a handful of magical realist events in 100 Years of Solitude. What it is mostly is an enormous family saga and mostly a psychological novel, you know, but of course it's framed by, you know, who is telling it and who writes it. So I think that combination that even unsophisticated readers can appreciate of a bold way to tell a story, but mostly fueled by the passions of the characters. You know, hence I think the division between those who like 100 Years of Solitude and those who love in the Time of Cholera. You know, Love in the Time of Cholera is in many ways a more 19th century novel than 100 Years of Solitude. It's not a postmodern novel. But people just connect to the amount of life that is in the books.
And I think that's certainly a very good way of putting it. So maybe this is for another conversation because we're actually out of time. But you know, one of the findings in my book is actually the first readers of the novel, including critics, never labeled the novel as magical realism. That was actually something that came after the fact.
Yes, I'm sure.
The first 2 years of the novel, you know, people were basically trying to understand it with the available categories. And then only a tiny minority of, actually one person I only found that said that this could be an example of magical realism as taken from the Venezuelan tradition, right? It was actually a Venezuelan critic, but yeah. Anyway, well, Rodrigo, I just want to stop here. I just want to thank you for our conversation. It has been wonderful.
Absolutely, very enjoyable.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Now I have to recuperate from it because it's taken me somewhere.
Okay, well,
yeah.
Thank you again, Rodrigo.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.